All right. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. I don't know how long a lot of you have been involved, but I'm here with Frieder Hochheim, who is the inventor and founder of Kino Flow. To my understanding, he was about a gaffer for about 20 years before he started the company. And then after overwhelming success, he sort of blew off people like Conrad Hall in order to pursue the job. His words.
I didn't say blow off. I said, regrettably had to say I'm not available.
Potato, potato, you know, Frieder, it's whatever narrative you want to create, that's fine with me. But this one's really exciting, guys. I don't know, Frieder, I had the great opportunity to sort of chat through some of what we're talking about today with Frieder a couple weeks, and this is really exciting stuff. This kind of answers a lot of questions that I myself had, and I still do. And I'm just excited to see this seminar as much as you guys. I'm not going to take up that much time. I just want to sort of be a facilitator to answer your questions. I think Frieder had put it best that we want to treat this as a pub night. So it's just a guy with a laptop that happens to have some answers for you. So whenever you have a question, please inundate me with them, and then we'll sort of put them through to Frieder. There's a lot of material to get through, and all of it is incredible. Without further ado, Frieder.
Thank you very much for that kind of introduction, although I never blew off Connie Hall. So yeah, I'm a former Toronto lad, moved to Los Angeles back in '83 and to pursue my career. So, you know, starting Kino Flow was all about getting the color right on a fluorescent. And I was very blessed to have you know, the assistance of Kodak at the time. They helped me formulate, or basically guided me in the formulation of the spectrum that would render the phosphorus correctly so they harmonized with film. And now we're dealing with the LED technology. We're dealing with electronic cinema. And when you think about it, in the old days, it was pretty straightforward. You know, you had film stocks and you had a mechanical camera. So there was much less to worry about. And so this presentation here, I've been doing internationally. I think the biggest presentation I had was to the Beijing Film Academy, which tied it into a bunch of other universities and cinema societies across China. And we had 2,100 attendees, all of this being translated. It ran about 3.5 hours. And it started at 9 o'clock at night for me. So I'm going to try and move it along a lot quicker than that, though. So let me just give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about here today. So I'm going to talk about the spectral response differences in cameras. I'm going to talk about color gamuts, which we always refer to gamut, but everything has a gamut, various devices. We'll explore that. When we talk about white light spectrum, there's a lot of differences in white light spectrum. We'll explore that. We'll talk about the challenges of color matching between manufacturers of lighting instruments. Talk about how to use gamut, how to use XY in trying to match gel colors. And then I'll talk about how to use a camera, you know, camera profiles to account for these differences in camera response. So I thought it was worth viewing a film that was put together by Jeff Boyle of the Cinematographer's mailing list. And here his notion was very simply, you know, let's just illustrate the frustration of what we're dealing with when it comes to LED, and in fact, just in general, cinema cameras. His thought was the one constant that we have internationally, pretty much, is tungsten light. We set up a tungsten light, let's get a range of cameras, dial them all into tungsten mode, and roll camera, let's see what it looks like. The second shot you'll see here on each one of these cameras is a LED light source dialed into the same Kelvin as the camera is set to, so tungsten. Jeff never told me what LED manufacturer it was, and it really doesn't matter because this is about looking at the differences between the different cameras. And so I'll just roll it and you can sort of see. So the first shot is the tungsten followed by an LED. There's your LED. And what's interesting to note is the difference in how the tungsten registers between the different cameras. You see the differences there. And then how the LED changes the perception on the different cameras. And so you can really start to see some of these different hue angle, the hue color differences between the tungsten and the LED and how it changes between manufacturers. So from this, you can really see that range. And this is, a day in the life of your life, our life, when we're dealing with all these different cameras. You would expect, at least in where you have a constant tungsten, there would be consistency between the manufacturers. It's the one target you'd think you'd be able to hit. Yet we see these, some of them very dramatic differences. And why is that? So we need to first of all understand, when we talk about light, what exactly is, how do we look at light? Now, some of this, many of you may already know, some of you may not know it at all. So if I'm somewhat repetitious here, my apologies in advance, but this way we all approach it from a single perspective here. So on the left, we have the 1931 CIE color space horseshoe. On the outside perimeter are all the saturated colors. In the middle is white light as we see it. And there's a line that runs through it. It's called the black body curve or the Plancking curve. And I'll explain that a little more as we move along. Another way of visualizing spectrum is on a basic Kelvin scale. And so at 400, between 400 and 700 is essentially what our eyes are capable of perceiving. Everything to the right of 700 is infrared. I cannot see that. Some cameras did see it at one point, but now they're filtered for it. 400 nanometers, everything below 400 is ultraviolet. Again, our eye doesn't see it. When we talk about the black body curve, it's also known as the Planckian locus. Now, the black body curve, all Kelvin light basically tracks along that curve. So when we think of it, why do we call it a black body? Well, if you think of a filament, again, we're talking about correlated color temperature expressed in Kelvin. Kelvin is an actual temperature. So if you think of a filament, and as it heats up, you see it start to change color. And just as that, we track the Planckian curve along that white line. So each one of these intersecting lines is known as a CCT value. So you can be anywhere on that line. You can be above it, you can be below it, be below it. If you fall below it, you're going to look somewhat magenta. If you fall above it, you're going to be slightly green. If you're on the line, it's going to be neutral. So we've always developed our, Kino developed its own lamps. So we were fully aware of what spectrum was and what we needed to render correctly on film. And we had about three sources. We had a 2900, a 3200, and a 5500. So here, moving into LEDs, we thought, well, what could be easier? We already know phosphors. Let's just make sure that we have a spectrum formulated on a phosphor-based LED. Well, let's pick 2700 and 6500 and just blend the two. And we've got a range of Kelvin temperature. Well, this is what basically a bicolor LED is. And one thing you notice is that when you combine the two, they track on a linear, it's a linear relationship. It doesn't actually follow the Planckian curve. So what does this mean? The minute, as long as you're shooting in around the source Kelvin, where you've established your starting point, the light is going to appear pretty much neutral. You're not going to see a green magenta hue. But the minute you start blending the two, now you fall off the Planckian, and now you're going into magenta. And this is true of all bicolor LEDs. It was true of the Kino first bicolor LEDs. But we had a gel frame with it. You could add some eighth or quarter correction, and that pretty much took care of it. But this was not the way that we could move forward. So we decided, well, let's start adding some RGBs, but simply by adding RGBs, we could now add some green to it as we're blending, lift up that color point, and actually track the plankton. Well, in that we also analyzed the camera response of various cameras. We realized that not all cameras track the same. And a lot of this has to do just with their spectral distribution, their spectral sensitivity distribution. So some cameras we discovered track slightly above, some slightly below, some actually track on the plankton. But there was this variable. So how do we deal with that? So you have to think of every electronic cinema was kind of like a film stock. Film stocks always had their particular characteristics and color responses, and cinematographers would choose a film stock based on the type of shooting they're doing. You know, some, like the Fujifilm, had a more vibrant green. If you're doing a lot of exterior shooting and you really want those vibrant greens, maybe that would have been a better choice for you. Every cinematographer developed their own choice of film stock that they preferred shooting with. The electronic cinema camera is no different. When we think of lights in the old days, all lights have historically harmonized with film. And I thought about, well, what the hell did they shoot back in 1901? Because I could see these interiors were shot with, they were soft lit. And I also knew that they were shooting orthochromatic film, sensitive only to blue and green light, but 5 ASA. I mean, we're dealing with 1200, 1600 ISO now. Imagine trying to shoot at 5 ASA. Well, I discovered these lights called Cooper Hewitts. And here you had, and this is what we're seeing in these images from 1901, essentially a mercury discharge lamp that was bright, yet fully harmonized to the response of the film. The film was only responding to blue and green. And this light output, this spectrum was only a blue-green spectrum, perfectly harmonized. So just a side note, in 1908, when we had the pandemic, these lights were actually emitting ozone, as well as being more than likely, they were very definitely had a high UV content. So they were antibacterial. Whether that was noted at the time, what people did note is that it was very irritating to the eye. And in between takes, they would actually wear yellow glasses. They were actually getting retinal burn. So much for worker safety. Here's an image from Metro Studios before they became Metro Goldwyn Mayer. They look like a bunch of Kino flows. These are Cooper Hewitts, and they're all on a pulley system because that's how the lamp would be ignited. It had a fist-size ball of mercury at the end of a lamp. The lamp was about the diameter of a T12 fluorescent. In order to ignite the fixture, the entire fixture would have to be tilted so the mercury would run to one end, it would ignite, and then pull a plasma stream down to the other end. So I thought, just an interesting aside, even in those days of the advent of cinema, we had a light source that harmonized. Following that, we got into panchromatic film. So that meant that tungsten light, carbon arcs, quartz, as we got into colors, xenons, HMIs, the fluorescent, even the fluorescent, as much as we said, wow, it's got a green spike, by putting it on that Planckian curve and neutralizing the green spike, we were able to render a full spectrum light that was perfectly harmonized to film response. Yet here we are today. LEDs, by their very nature, are discontinuous spectrum. There are portions of the spectrum that are lacking. So this is the first time that we're being asked to work with a light source that is not, quite frankly, as great as we've had in previous years. Also, we're dealing with cameras that have different spectral response curves. So when you think about it, Kodak embedded all the color science in the film emulsion. All you had to do is, you could pick any camera you want, any lenses. There were slight variances in lens coatings and whatnot that might present problems, but things were pretty straightforward. Today, we're dealing in a color science that's embedded in the lighting fixture, and we have multiple manufacturers of lighting fixtures, all of which have different levels of sophistication in understanding the spectrum that's needed for camera. And then you have cameras that all have different response curves. Put the two together, perfect recipe for chaos. Excuse me. So how do we actually measure these? And these are all the tools that we've had up until recently. Some of you may recognize some old Minoltas here in these Sekonics. These old Minoltas never really worked great on fluorescent, but they were the only tool we had, and we sort of learned to work with them. Spectrometer, like this UPR tech gives you spectral information, but it doesn't really relate to what we need as a cinematographer. So when we talk about, which units to use, the Sekonic C800 or I'm showing here a 700. These are the Sekonic is actually a meter that's designed for photography and cinematographers. And for those of you that are still clinging to your old Minoltas, I always have a suggestion, and that is to throw a garden party, invite your friends, dig a hole, bury this puppy, pop off a few bottles of champagne, enjoy the afternoon. Either that or, put it in a museum. But for God's sake, please don't use it. Again, these meters all have different ways of reading light, and I'll talk about some of those different parameters. So really, none of these handheld color meters, though, are designed to give you corrective data relative to camera response. Now, the Sekonic is based on the spectral response of an averaged HDSLR. So you can't really take those corrective suggestions as a given. It's a guide, and you sort of have to find your way to see what works for you. CRI is one of those indexes that keeps being referred to by manufacturers of lights. Purely, this is an old standard based on the eye's perception. There are two standards, CRI 8 or 15, and that relates to either 8 chips or 15 color chips. Now, the CIA, the International Commission on Illumination, and the Illuminating Engineering Society both have rejected this as a basis of trying to evaluate LEDs. Should not be done. In fact, they're suggesting it now be replaced with TM-30-15, 18 referring to the year that the standard was adopted. This is a standard that's evolving, and you'll see a new standard coming out. It'll most probably be, I think maybe 21 is the next one that they're putting out. Again, similar in principle to CRI, but instead of 15 colors, they're using 99 colors. Now, what's relevant to us as cinematographers is the fidelity index. It's referred to as RF. And that characterizes the average difference in color for those 99 CES, those color evaluation samples at a given Kelvin or to a reference point. Data is scored from 0 to 100. The other one is the Gambit Index. And this one is interesting because it characterizes the average saturation level of these different colors. Now, that data is scored a little differently. It's from 60 to 140. So now a score below 100 would indicate less saturation. Above it, more saturation. But what do you do with this data? Does it give you actionable data as a cinematographer that you can go and try to correct one fixture over another fixture? It doesn't really do that. TLCI, this is also available on the Sekonic, Television Lighting Consistency Index. It's another way of subjectively trying to understand the differences between two light sources. Now, this data was built around the camera sensors of HD TV broadcast studio cameras. These are not related to cinema cameras, but it gives you sort of a subjective comparison of what to expect from a light source. Sadly, it doesn't give us corrective measures, but a high value may indicate, may still indicate some, put it this way, it doesn't indicate problems when it comes to the green magenta side. So bottom line, again, is that there's really no actionable data, but it gives you a general idea that this light may be good, but it may also still be disappointing. SSI, Spectral Similarity Index, developed by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And again, this is out of the frustration of not having an index that really gives us actionable data. Now, does this actually give us actionable data? Not really. They also decided, let's not base it on human vision as all the other ones are. Let's base it on just how you compare two light sources, an artificial light source to a tungsten. And so rendered here, that's sort of a tungsten curve. And we see 400 nanometers to 700 is the end of the scale. Now, you overlay an LED spectrum on top of that, and you see these offsets. So what they do is they apply a mathematical value to these offsets and calculate it out and come up with a score of up to 100. Now, how to use this? It says, well, these are their words, not mine. High values indicate predictable rendering by most cameras, as well as quality of visual appearance. They don't define what a high value is. I guess that's up to us to decide. Low values may produce good colors with a particular camera, but not with others. As vague goes, let's be as vague as we can. Again, this doesn't give me something that I can use as a cinematographer. I could maybe use this to compare two LED sources and see how close they are, but it still doesn't give us corrective data on how we could maybe possibly clean this up. If I were to use this and compare sources in pre-production and just say, well, where do the numbers fall? So CRI is at 97, although again, we're not supposed to be using that anymore because it's not as relevant. TLCI, high number, it's a good indicator. SSI 71, whoa, compared to everything else, that's a low number. I'd most probably reject that light. Now, this happens to be our spectrum in daylight. And we know that it's actually one of the best spectrums out there. And when you look at the TM30 numbers, you can see this is the color circle. It's totally fleshed out. So you've got about as much spectrum there as you can possibly hope to eke out of an LED. So this is where I feel SSI falls short. I think it's an effort in the right direction, but I find it difficult to, I can't use it as we're developing our spectrum to determine whether this is going to be good or not for a cinema camera. So finding all of these devices inadequate, we decided that we're going to build our own spectrometer, and using this, working together with the same color scientists at Kodak, we said, can't we just develop this? Kodak had this wonderful spectrometer where they had logged all of the spectral response curves of motion picture film. And so you could go to Kodak and say, here's a light source I want to harmonize to the film stock. What do I need to do to filter the camera or filter the light? And then they would simply take a measurement with this and put in the film stock, and they would give you an exact correction. They even had the lens coatings of the different lenses. So they had a huge catalog of a few hundred lenses that you could pinpoint within 2 decimal points and be correct. That same scientist, Mitch Magdanovic, is retired. He's still active in the industry. So he came on as a consultant for Kino and he helped develop what we see here in front of us. So this is sort of my work field when we develop when we develop a light source. So just to give it an explanation, down here we have a raw scope. You capture the spectrum, and then you render it out. You calibrate it. And that is the actual true spectral signature of our starting point, which is 2700 Kelvin. You can see the 400 nanometers down here. You see that there's not a lot of spectral information between 400 and 450. And then at 700, you can see it drops off precipitously. You have your XY position on the black body curve. It's on the curve, which is where we want it to be. And then you see a number of rows here of data. And these are actual color readings taken by 3 cameras, the Amira, Mysterium, and the Panavision 8K Red. I have a lot of cameras to choose from, but we've modeled a lot of them, but just for this illustration, those are the 3 that I chose. And so it'll give you this camera data. And what was really interesting when we started doing this is you start to understand the differences in how these cameras perceive the same Kelvin source. Because the cameras have different response curves, and because this spectrum is discontinuous, they all seem to put out different information. So this first line of data here is the actual CCT. That's what this curve actually measures out to on a spectrometer. The second line is the one that kind of blew me away, and that is how the camera actually perceives that light. So the Amira, very accurately, again, you have to give some tolerance here, is, you know, we're aiming at 2700. You know, to be very precise, we're at 2659. The camera read it at 2718. That is fabulous. Those are great numbers. On the Mysterium, we're seeing it at 2558. And on the Panavision 8K Red, we're seeing it at 2391. So already out of the gate, where you think there would be consistency and understanding in rendering that light, you see how each camera renders it slightly warmer than the next. And that's sort of reflected in the camera test that we did earlier. You see how the cameras see tungsten differently. There's other data here, the photo CCT that refers to the old Minoltas and just goes to show how far off the old Minoltas were. The CIE XY color points are just another way, that's more data relevant to the black body curve. And then down here, we have what we call Photographic Rendering Index. That is the average, once we shoot a Macbeth chart and we analyze those color swatches, we see how much of that spectrum is actually being rendered out to a given, to a tungsten light source, so by comparison. So we're seeing that all of these cameras fall into the mid 90s or high 90s, all of which are good. That means they're capturing a tremendous amount of that spectrum. We see that the Aries seems to be doing just a shade better than the other cameras, but these are all very good numbers. And whether you could subjectively see that difference, it'd be very hard to say. The last row of information that is important to me as a developer of the spectrum is to understand the offset from the Planckian. Am I going slightly green? Am I going slightly magenta? And so these were, you know, to 2 decimal point accuracy, you know, an indicator of which direction the camera seems to see the hue. Is it on the Planckian or is it slightly off? These basically should be considered on the Planckian as they're reading it. But you can see one is tending a little magenta, one is tending a little green. To actually correct that, a 0.12 value equals 1/8 of a correction. So there's no correction necessary on that. I can pause for a moment if there are any questions at this point. So I'll move along.
No, we have one question.
One question. Or if you want to, I think you can open the mic on whoever's asking the question and we can actually chat about it.
Jason George has a question asked, does the metadata of the camera affect this?
No. This is completely independent of metadata. This is measured spectral data off the camera that we then process.
Jason's saying, is this all raw measurements?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. If I can actually give you Mitch's explanation of how we do this is as follows, because this question comes up often. And I'll just read it because this is the most accurate way of describing it. So the camera response data is gathered using a scanning monochromator driven by a stepping motor and a computer with a half bandwidth of about 4 nanometers sampled every 2 nanometers, and data averaged within each frame with an area to include the center, says tilde quarter of the full camera frame. In a fictitious frame of 4,000 by 2,000 equals 8 million divided by 4 equals 2 million points to average. The raw output files in the camera logs metric are processed with the camera software, debayered or demosaic to the highest color space volume available, which is usually linear ACES AP APO, AP0. And this metric is then converted to all other color spaces. The data is then processed to assure proper luminance at each wavelength and interpolated to one nanometer output data. That's a science. When you ask a scientist, that's what he's going to answer. Bottom line is, it's strictly off the data that comes off that camera, taking the raw files and running it through through the camera manufacturer's methodology of extracting the data. So it's about as accurate as we think we can get. Now, Mitch has been working also with a number of other camera manufacturers to help them in setting their color parameters. I know he's been working with Red and he's been working with Panavision. So our data, I think, is pretty solid.
There's a question that Jason had, a follow-up question about OLPFs and how those sort of skew. It's specifically on Red cameras. They add a little bit of a like a piece of glass to sort of augment, so it can augment more towards like pleasing skin tones they have or anything like that.
Yeah. In fact, this is something that we've noticed between manufacturers. There's there's two philosophies of thought. One is, if you're going to be if you're a color scientist, you go, I need a neutral white. When I set the camera at, let's say 3200, I have a clean on 3200 Kelvin source, that should render neutral gray. Now, when you look at a skin tone at neutral gray, it may not look as warm as you'd want it to. So I think what's happened is that manufacturers have gone ahead and just tweaked their cameras ever so slightly to give it a more pleasing skin tone. Now, some of this is also culturally significant, because certain cultures, such as the Japanese culture, is vying for more of a whiter skin tone than a warmer skin tone, as other parts of the world might want to render it. And I've noticed that even when we were developing our KF32, our KF29 lamp, we couldn't sell a KF29 lamp in Japan. They wouldn't take it. They preferred a whiter rendering on the skin tones. So these are some things that we've noticed on cameras, that they've skewed them a little bit one way or the other, instead of going straight what I would think would be the more neutral route. But I think this is where marketing comes into it. And yeah, that camera just looks better because we are culturally biased to the aesthetic of our preferred skin tones. At least that's how I see it.
There's another question here that Sepe, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. I noticed from setting up multi-camera shoots how body to body there's quite a big difference in how it responds. Has this been taken into account?
Say that again. How?
For multi-camera shoots, body to body, there's a quite difference. Now, are you shooting multiple cameras there, or are you shooting all the same bodies? Maybe you can just give me.
By bodies referring to what body? Camera body, human body?
Yeah, I'm actually asking for clarification on that. Maybe you can give me, are you using all the same camera bodies there, Sep?
Yeah, he's asking about the same camera body and how some sensors read differently just from body to body.
Yeah. This is where color calibration is so critical. These chips that they're using are very sophisticated chips. They're very well designed, and I think there's no reason that a camera body should not be aligned and calibrated to match. And this is the frustration I think that we have. When you're in a rental market and things move very quickly in and out, in pre-production, these cameras have to be aligned. And if you're in the midway through a shoot and you just bring on a new camera and it has not necessarily been color matched, you may find some differences. I mean, this is why in film, I just remember before you start a feature and you order up whatever 300,000 feet of film, it all had to be the same Same batch, same batch number. You went to the same lab. I mean, you try to take out all variables that would influence the color reproduction. Yet in electronic cinema, we tend to be a little more cavalier because we have a monitor. You can say, we can fix it in post. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
We have a question here from a colorist or an on-set DIT, Andrew Richardson. When live color grading on set, developing looks often relies on the harmony between how camera sensor perceives light and the quality of light emitting from the light sources. When we apply LUTs to change the color input values of the camera, would it also make sense to use similar transforms in the lighting?
Woof.
Yeah.
That you know what? I think once we dig deeper into this, you'll start to see what happens. Because you need to understand what, in fact, is happening spectrally. So let me dig deeper into it and you'll start to understand the complexity. It's not that simple because there are huge variables between manufacturers of LED. So let me just forge ahead and I'll talk about, I'll just start to illustrate some examples of, you know, spectral distribution so we get a better understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
So this is what our eye sees. Red, green, blue. That's basically what we've agreed to. You've got 400 nanometers down here. We don't see ultraviolet. We don't see IR. There's 700 down here. Film stock, daylight. Film stock, this is Kodak Daylight. And, you know, as much as we think film was the ultimate sort of in color rendering, it had its issues. So one of the first things you see at 400, it has sensitivity into the ultraviolet. And with ultraviolet, you've got to worry about exposure on the, you know, of the sky. So we had UV filters, we had sky filters that would take down that sensitivity. When we look at the offset of the red from our eye, you can see there's a difference. So film always had certain issues with these deep troughs trying to render the color. Okay, hold on. I just saw a message here. Okay, now going back. So it's where these colors cross over. There's not a lot of sensitivity here. So when it came to film shooting, resolving cyan or teal, those were issues. Yellow orange between here, this was also an issue. So it was really incumbent on every production. In pre-production, you would shoot camera tests, you would shoot color tests. So if there was something in wardrobe, you had to make sure that the darn wardrobe was going to show as it was meant to be seen, as the eye was able to perceive it. Not doing that very often resulted in disappointment on the first day of shooting. Here is a camera response, electronic camera, very good camera, that has pretty much following the eye. So great color off this. I'm never going to talk about which curve responds to which camera because I'm not here to talk about different cameras or try to make one appear better than the other because they all render great color, but they're using different methodologies to arrive at that point. So what's important to understand is that there are these response differences. Use another electronic camera, very popular. You see immediately here that this one does have some sensitivity into the ultraviolet and it has a broader red response. Delivers great color, but it's different. And here's another one. Very different response curves, much narrower, but brilliant color off these this unit. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that these are all different cameras. They all have different ways of capturing light. And when you put this together with discontinuous spectrum, this is where you start to get some challenges. Color gamut. Every one of these devices has its own gamut, and they don't necessarily match or are the same. So it's important to understand that everything does have its limitations, and it's designed to respond to a certain range of color. And they're not all necessarily aligned. So over here on the left, we see Rec 709, and that's what's sort of traditionally considered the capture zone of 709. So that means that everything within that triangle will be displayed or reproduced or by that that camera. There are a number of gamuts that we talk about all the time. You know, P3, a little bigger than 709, used more for digital projection. Rec 2020, bigger still for HDR10 TV displays. And then the biggest one is ACES, and I'll get into the details on ACES in a few slides further on. Now, the camera may actually have a wider color gamut that can be displayed or projected. So with that in mind, you know, since we profiled the cameras, we're actually able to display that. If you go online and try to get this gamut off a camera, the manufacturers won't share this with you. I'm not really sure why, other than they're afraid that it's going to be used in a manner where people don't really understand the significance of gamuts. And it's just one part of information amongst a lot of other information that all adds up together to how these cameras process color and, you know, capture color and render it. But since we modeled them, we said, well, let's just display these, and here it goes. So in no particular order, these are the 4 cameras that I've displayed here. And I'll run it again. So what you see is that a number of them sort of fall into a similar area. All of them pretty much capture what's to be expected out of a 709, although there's a little bit of a cut into the deep blues. When you look at the reds, they all seem to capture red just a little differently. But then it still comes down to, you know, if the camera captures a certain amount of spectrum, what is your output spectrum going to be, or what is your workflow gamut going to be? And so capturing it in a broad gamut at least ensures that whether you're in P3, 709, or 2020 later on, you'll be able to output a lot of that information. What's important though on all of this is this zone right here in the middle, the white. And what you want to make sure is that these cameras are actually, your spectrum is full enough in spectral information that that white zone is used to capture and reproduce the colors. When we think of film, we never talked about gamut. But since we profiled film, we said, well, I was curious, what does this actually look like in terms of a gamut? So there's 2020, and here is tungsten film and daylight film. So tungsten and daylight follow pretty similar paths. And what I find interesting here is that when you look at the difference between 709 and 2020, and you're remastering negative films that were shot on negative and remastering them from 709 to 2020, you're actually going to realize in 2020 much more of the theater experience that the viewers had when that film was first produced. And I think that is a very good reason to want to remaster from 709 to 2020, because you are capturing a lot more vibrant spectrum that previously would have not been able to be reproduced in 709.
Frieder, I have a great question from a young guy called Adam here. I'm going to allow him to ask the question himself. Adam, ask your question, brother. Adam?
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, we got you.
Great. Yes. So I was asking, what's the purpose of extending the gamut outside of the visible range? And what I mean is the parts that go into the black, like the corner of the aces.
Well, again, they had to create a triangle, a gamut. A gamut is defined that way. It's purely a mathematical function at this point. I mean, there's nothing happening outside of the visible range. This is just a way of mathematically tracking color points. And so you had to have 3 points in order to capture the full visible range. So yeah, you end up, it looks odd. You have these black patches out there, but it's purely, you know, it's a mathematical function. It serves no purpose from a cinematographer's perspective in terms of any kind of visual significance.
So how would they find those points if they don't exist as colors, if they're extending?
Well, they're not looking for color out there. It's more what's happening within the technology that we're working with and where those color points fall. And you're basically drawing a frame. Basically, that triangle is a frame around your color data. And so they're saying, if we do a big enough frame that captures the entire visible field, anything that comes in the future, we can talk about it. We can plot it. So and I'm going to explain that more in the next slide.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
All right. As we were saying, the ACES Gamut, the Academy Color Encoding System. Now, this was created as a way of creating what we previously had as a film negative. This was now going to be an electronic negative. So it's a means of encompassing the entire visible spectrum and being able to plot color points that will be generated by the technology that we're working with. So the ACES space is really designed as a future-proof system of data collection. We call that a digital source master. Now, through the use of programming language called CTL, or color transform language, once an image has been mastered in ACES, it should not have to be remastered as a new visual format comes up. So if you're going from one technology base to another, you could use your ACES CTLs, or through CTLs, you could transform all that data that you have stored on how that negative was treated. You should be able to rewrite it now and render it out the way that film was intended to be viewed. So that means, in a very strong sense, the author of the image, the intent of that author will be maintained. If you did not have the CTL and you simply had color data in there, as soon as it goes to a new format, now it's up to who to remaster the film. Not knowing the cinematographer's intent, you can imagine you'll end up with a very different looking movie. That's not to say that even with CTL, there's nothing to stop someone from going in, using the color codes that they have and altering them to fit a new reality. Now, it's one thing for a cinematographer to do that, because they're now able to render colors brighter, not brighter, more saturated, or who knows what. At least let it be the cinematographer that makes those changes that go beyond the original intent. Now, this is a standard that is still being developed. It's still evolving, and it's all in how the metadata is being processed and being stored. But that in sort of a nutshell is what it's trying to do. Excuse me. Kino Flow's fixtures, they have a gamut. And that's predicated by the choice of our red, green, blue. When you look at 709, it's fully captured within that. When you look at P3, there's a little sliver there that we sort of miss out on. And when we go to 2020, again, it's the greens, the yellows that are difficult to capture with that green point. So our objective is, as we develop our technology, to try to move that green point further over here to get more of the P3 and 2020 spectrum. So RGB colors is what really defines that range of the gamut. But again, what's really important is what's happening in here in the white, because for the most part, it's all about white light on subject, and how does that white light spectrum truly reflect back the colors that that the light is falling on. And that's really key. Now, when we try to mix colors or generate colors, because my philosophy was this: I need to have a good, clean, broad, full spectrum light, no matter whether I'm in the warm tones or the daylight tones. And using the RGBs, I can now track the Planckian, and I know I can cover pretty much any sort of anomaly on a camera. If I have to track it slightly above or below, I can make all of those adjustments. Now, if I need to generate a color, and to me, this color generation is sort of a bonus. We've got a great white light fixture. You want to generate some colors. Well, you can do that through additive color mixing. So you can take the green and the red and mix them together, and you can end up, you know, wherever you want to be along that line. Same thing goes for blue, red, blue, green. So that process, additive color mixing. Now, if I need to try to get colors that are outside the, that's, you know, that triangle, I'm going to have to add more color points. And so doing that, you can do that with amber and cyan, lime green, rose red. And these are traditionally what manufacturers will do. They'll add additional LED wavelengths. And so as you can see, it expands the gamut. And now you can start to capture some of those saturated colors, which you wouldn't get just simply with 3 primaries. Well, what's still important is you know, you can maybe hit those saturated colors, but if you're still working in 709, how much of that are you going to actually benefit from? So going to 2020 and P3, obviously, you'll start to realize some of those color points.
I have a question actually that I want to ask about that.
Yeah.
Which is Roscoe at one point branched out and made an LED gel series of lines. Are these the traditional sort of like rattan kind of style, amber, cyan, lime green, rose gold gels, or are they specially augmented for LEDs?
You know, I could never quite understand that because there's so many variables in the light from different manufacturers. And Lee did the same thing. They came out with an LED line of gels. And when I asked them, well, what predicated on what spectrum? And they could never really answer that. So to me, I think it's sort of a failed, in my mind, it was just a failed marketing response to a new technology where people starting to mix colors and oh, people were really having serious issues because the hue differences between manufacturers, and they were trying to cover them. I mean, you basically could have done much of the same thing using green magenta correction, but in their case, they may have also been doing a little bit to alter the Kelvin, raising it up or dropping it. You know, we looked at those gels and went, well, I didn't even know when and how to use them, to be quite honest. So I hope that answers it.
It does. It does. Thank you.
Yeah. So the full white spectrum is what's common to all of these gamuts. And that's really where the bulk of all of our color rendering is taking place. So that full spectrum white really ensures, you know, our best skin tone reproduction as well as color reproduction that's coming back on, you know, whatever the objects are that are in the field, because they really reflect colors. Now these, if you have a good full spectrum white light, it'll actually reflect colors that may fall out. So if you have a saturated color that you can't reproduce, but it's an object that you can photograph and white light falls on that, it'll actually display it outside your workflow gamut. So as an example, there's a color point out there, and you can't get there through color mixing. But so additive color mixing isn't going to do it. So the white spectrum now has all the wavelengths that you need in order to potentially get out there. So what you do is you do subtractive color mixing. You put a gel on it, and now you're just letting through that one wavelength, and that gel now actually puts you out there and gives you that color rendering that you couldn't do additively. So there are limitations to additive color mixing. Bottom line is subtractive color mixing is still going to be your most accurate, I think, if you have, as long as it still comes down to a caveat, as long as you still have a full spectrum white. Now, if you're only working, I'll get into it further about explaining full spectrum, but anyway, so that's a principle that bottom line says, don't throw your gels away. They still serve a significant purpose.
I just have one more question before we move on, Frieder, here. I'm going to actually allow Jason George to have the floor for a second. He's got a couple questions here. Jason, can you hear us?
Hello, Jason. Cannot hear you.
Jason, just unmute yourself and then you can talk. I can actually ask you to unmute here.
You also have 2 accounts open, Jason, so I don't know which one. I'll try the other one as well. 1 second. Jason George allowed to talk. There we go. Jason?
Yeah, here we are. Hi.
Hello, there you go.
There.
How you doing?
Good.
Great. I was just curious about 709 and 2020 with cameras that have the ability to choose either of those 2 spaces. Is there any reason for or against one or the other as a shooting color space choice?
I don't think it's to me, it all comes down to what your final, output workflow is going to be. I mean, you're going to be asked to remaster in 709, and you'll be asked to remaster in P3 in 2020 now. At least that's what I'm hearing from DPs that I'm talking to. It's not just, the mastering session isn't just in one gamut. They're trying to hit all of them. So the broader a gamut, you can, first of all, the camera itself is capable of capturing, for the most part, 2020. So going for the broadest capture to me would be the goal. And then if you're going to go 709, you're just going to realize a desaturation of certain vibrant colors. But the more data is better than less. But again, if you're just, if it's more about viewing your output display, then that's another story altogether. That's purely a personal choice at that point.
Right. Great. Thank you.
All right.
And I want to remind anybody, if you don't want to write your question in the Q&A, you could also put your hand up in the participant section, and actually at the bottom of your screens, you should have a raise hand option, so you don't have to write out your question.
Subtractive versus additive color mixing. Now, I also lecture at the American Film Institute, and one of the professors at AFI came to the ASC Technology Committee with a problem. They're trying to figure it out. They're saying, maybe you could explain the phenomenon that we saw. And so I'll just give you a little background here. So the fellows at AFI are required to deliver a look book prior to production. So essentially, what are they striving for in terms of the look? And in this particular production, they were going to be using yellow color as a thematic recurring sort of theme within the production. And they chose Storaro yellow from Roscoe. And part of pre-production testing was just to see how close the LED fixtures could reproduce that yellow gel color, or would they have to do everything with true gel? So the test was pretty straightforward. They, first of all, took measurement on a tungsten light, came in at 2900. They set the camera to 2900, put a gel on the tungsten fixture, and it rendered out as yellow as you would expect. The next test was to take a LED fixture, dial it to 2900K as a white spectrum. That's what that looked like. Then they added physical gel to it, came out looking yellow. I reproduced this just using a Canon D5. Then the next thing was, okay, let's just use the additive color of the LED. The camera is still dialed to 2900 response because we're going to be working with other tungsten sources. And what did that look like? You went, oh, geez, something's obviously wrong. So what went wrong? What's wrong here? I said, well, other than the fact that it's green, why is it green? Well, we thought because they're working off a desk, maybe there was a miscommunication. Maybe there's, so they checked all of that. And then they went in and tried to manipulate the controls, the XY controls, RGB controls, and they could not get rid of this green. They could not hit the color yellow. And so they came to the ASC and said, why is this? Well, my thought was, well, if the camera's set at 2900, the eye is seeing yellow, but the camera's seeing green. Obviously, there's an inability of the response of that camera to resolve that spectrum, that yellow, when the camera is set to 29. So I took the camera and dialed it back to a 6500 response, and it came in yellow. So what that tells me is that the camera did not have the ability to resolve additive color two narrow bands of red and green, was not able to resolve that when the native color of that camera was dialed down to 2900. So we have to remember that most camera chips, for the most part, I mean, they're all based around D65 or D55 as a color base, a color standard. And once you go off of that, algorithmically, you're changing that response. And so this is what happened in this case. So I wanted to understand this a little more. And so I thought, well, why don't I actually just look at it as a spectral chart? And so what's interesting is the gel, this green line here and everything below it, this is what yellow gel on a tungsten source, the tungsten is the red. There's a tremendous amount of spectral data going on here. Here's 700 nanometers down here. Here's 400 nanometers, so UV. So you can see there's a ton of spectral information that the camera has to work with. The next one was LED. And now we see the blue line here represents a gel on the LED. And still, there's a big volume of spectral data here that the camera can process. And it came out okay. Next step. And here it starts to tell the story of why. So the red line represents here, this peak is red, this peak is green. So from having this volume here that's encompassed by the blue, reduced down to red and green, you see how much of a lack of spectrum there is. And the camera at 2900 just cannot resolve that as a yellow. It sees it more as a green. So, you know, subtractive color in green and blue lines represented a lot of spectrum. When it comes to additive, now you're just adding those elements together. And when the camera is away from its native, color base, that's when it gets challenging. There are little tests that you can shoot in advance to understand how a camera is going to see the color differently. So if you know you're shooting in a tungsten environment and you want to see what these colors are going to look like additively, you can actually do a test. So here I've compared, this camera's at 6500K. This camera's set to 2900K. And then we just run and I've aligned them so that you can actually see the hue angle. If you look at the top scale, it says H and SAT. So that's your hue angle and saturation. And you actually start to see those differences in perception. Now, once the color is fully saturated, your eye will see it more like it is down on the bottom frame. But at the top, that's the best that you're going to capture on that camera set to 29. And this is actually a test that you can do in pre-production so that in production you and this is also a way of sorting out what instruments you want to work with. You find the instruments that may give you that a better color rendering or a more fleshed out color response. And you can also see that the difference in color when you look at the yellow of the display, the same yellow displayed over here looks green. And really it does reflect that issue that we saw on the color test that we did.
I also want to just add that it's important to note that Frieder is generically saying the word camera here, and he's not specifying the type of camera, but every camera is going to react differently. So the reason the test is so important is because even most of the chips and sensors that exist out there do resolve in this like D65 native sensor. Every camera is going to sort of have a different reaction of how 3200 resolves based and predicated on their design of their daylight sensor.
Yeah. On our lighting fixtures now, we can actually dial in the gamut. And the reason for this, and I go on to explain it further in the presentation, is how do you harmonize between different manufacturers where we all have our own gamut? So once you have, because Gamut defines the color, and the numbers that you have to input onto a lighting disk in order to get to the color points, they're all predicated on the native gamut of the fixture, unless you can take that gamut and redefine it as a common gamut. So you say, I'm going to put all my color in a 709 space, and let's see how that looks. Well, so here's an example of a camera test where on the upper portion here, I've dialed in 709. So 709 is different from the native gamut, which is larger, and you would expect to see color differences. And so you're going to see slight desaturation, but when it comes to particular colors, you already see, because of their desaturation, how different they look. And so they're going to be colors that you can get to in one that you won't have in the other. Again, so it really comes down to, in pre-production, if there are specific colors that are thematically significant or important to the director, it really behooves you to do those color tests under the different Kelvin environments you'll be working in to understand how they're going to reproduce. It's really critical. Now, the Kino flows also have the ability that once you select from our gel menu, we can actually shift the white color point below it. So most manufacturers that I've been able to research here, you can either pick 32 or daylight. Those are your two white points. And so if you have an instrument, be it an HMI or some other light source that has a warmer color point or a cooler color point, we can actually match to that. So if you now take a gel and put it on that light source and compare it to a tungsten or another artificial light source with that particular Kelvin, we should be able to match them up pretty closely. So having a white color point is significant, because it'll actually reflect what that color looks like when it's in that environment. White LED systems. This is sort of an illustration of many of the different ways that we can achieve what we call white light. And this is what you are dealing with on a daily basis when you simply select a fixture without understanding how it's achieving its spectrum. So the first one, phosphor whites, two of them, daylight, tungsten, bicolor, and you understand the issues that came up with that, because the minute you blend them, you fall into the magenta, and this is common to all bicolors. We always knew that RGBs, in theory, you mix them together, there's always going to be a white. But since you have only 3 bands of color, and it's a very spiky light spectrum, and you're throwing away a tremendous amount of spectrum that needs to fall on a subject to reflect back accurately. So RGB in and of itself will never do it. Single white and RGB, a lot of that out there. So major manufacturers have chosen this. The downside is that let's say the upside is that when you're in the white zone, let's say you start off with a white that is in around the warm tone, 3200. So everything around there is now benefiting from the full spectrum of that white. But the minute you want to shift the Kelvin and go into daylight, the only way you can shift it into daylight is you've got 3 options: red, green, and blue. So you start pushing in more blue. That's a single band of blue. So mathematically, and on your meter, you can say, oh, I'm at 6,500 or I'm at 7,500. But when you look at the spectrum, you realize that now you've got a diminished spectrum compared to what you started with. Net result is your skin tones and that opposing Kelvin are not rendered as beautifully or as accurately as you would at your starting point. So you're actually, it's diminished spectrum having 1 white. And for us, it was important to have 2 whites for that very reason. Another technique is to add amber. In the theatrical market, that is one way of being able to get out to the yellows and give a few more colors. again, that's on a fixture where color is very important and the whites are less. Amber does absolute zippo when it comes to trying to flesh out your full spectrum white. It doesn't give you much advantage at all. In fact, no advantage. What we do at Kino Flow, I've described before, you know, a 2700 and a daylight, and using RGBs. The colors are a bonus. More important to us is the full white spectrum. There are other manufacturers are using, they're trying to flesh out, like I explained, where you can try to get a little more of the colors into it, but still you're only dealing with a single white phosphor. So because of the different response curves of the cameras, this can be sort of hit and miss. At times you can be spot on, at other times, maybe not as great. And the same thing goes for the last row here, where the idea is we're just going to slam in as many wavelengths as we can. And that, in theory, is also a way to go. But since the cameras respond so very differently, it really comes down to how well you maintain the calibration of all these different color points so that the camera sees it as white. And this is where I think as a manufacturer, if you're going to take that approach, you need to have a lot of knowledge of how the cameras are going to be seeing this light source. So not all white light is the same. And just to give you sort of an idea of what, when we analyze this, what it breaks down to is, let me go back. So in this illustration, we have the two whites in green, the warm white and the cool white, versus a single white. Now this is at 3200. So here's your red, your green, and your blue spike. And what we try to avoid whenever we're blending LEDs, this trough, this peak over here is your 450 nanometer exciter lamp. I mean, every LED starts with a blue emitter, and then they add a phosphor to it, and that's what gives it the spectrum. So every LED is going to have a spike, and that will revolve around whatever that emission blue line is. What we try to avoid is this deep peak, because this valley here, because that indicates a lower rendering. So at 3200, this is how the two compare. And you can see that the two whites over the single white has a bigger volume of spectral data. How does that actually break down when we analyze it? The XY coordinates, those work out nicely. When we look at it as our PRI, those numbers are all very nice. What we're doing here is we're comparing the Amira from 2 to a single white. And then we're looking at it on the Mysterium, how the single white is handled by the Mysterium. And so we can see a slight decline in overall rendering. When we look at the camera response over here, we can see again how they're viewing it differently. Again, we're targeting 3200. The Amira is capturing it on the full spectrum white closer to 32. The single white, because of the diminished spectrum, is also seeing it slightly warmer. And this one is seeing it sort of split the difference between the two. It's seeing at 28 versus 27. What's important here is that the full spectrum white needs no correction, 1/8 of a correction on the single white on the Amira, and as much as almost 1/4 on the Mysterium with a single white. And again, this is where the spectral response curves differ enough that they then render this color point, which is pretty much on the black body curve, how they see it, hue angle difference of that. And these are the kind of things, I mean, we're analyzing this mathematically in a controlled environment where when you're on a set, these are subtleties that may not be apparent until you're sitting quietly in the timing suite going, oh, geez, that looks a little green. So these colors represent the gel that we would use to correct for that. We look at in 6500, and again, we see how these spectral signatures differ. You try to get as smooth a line as you can. Again, the lower the dip in here indicates lower rendering. Try to avoid that. In this case, XY coordinates between these two sources was slightly off, which doesn't make a huge difference when we're in the daylight zone. The cameras are much more forgiving, as well as the eye's perception to that. So that's not an issue. PRI values generally fall in a good position. These are all still in the mid to high 90s. When we look at the correction, nothing needed over here on the Amira. Slight eighth of a correction, and I'd even go just with an eighth of a correction on the Mysterium. So in this case, on the daylight, all these cameras are going to get away with it. But you can see, again, there are these slight differences. What's really noticeable is the perception of the actual Kelvin by these cameras. And so we're seeing the Amira with a full spectrum white, seeing it about 1,000 Kelvin bluer than it's dialed in at. But the other cameras are seeing it substantially below that. And again, this is because we have a discontinuous spectrum and the response curve of the cameras are such that they render it warmer. Here we're comparing RGB, sapphire blue, cyan, lime green, amber. This is the concept of, we're going to use a bunch of different wavelengths. We're going to flesh out the entire spectrum, and we should, in theory, be able to hit all the wavelengths that represent white light. In theory, absolutely correct, but in practice, you need to be very cognizant of what the response curve of the camera is. So again, we're seeing a big difference in volume of spectrum, and how does that play out when we analyze it? XY coordinates aren't that dramatically off, close enough. Same over here. We're seeing not a, those numbers are all fine. We go up to the gels again, or we say, what is that correction off the Planckian? And we're not going to correct on the full spectrum 2 whites. Oops. Let's try that again. What we're seeing here, though, is although we have a high PRI, we're seeing a huge difference in the correction. We need as much as 1/8 and 1/4 magenta correction on the Amira with this multi-band concept of just trying to construct a spectrum. And pretty much the same thing over here on the Mysterium. So although the PRI numbers are high, it's still going to give you a green cast. And you want to find this out in pre-production, by the way. You don't want to find this out on the day. This is sort of the dog's breakfast that you have when you walk on a set and you've got a broad mix of lighting fixtures. You've got your 2 whites, your single white, and then the constructed spectrum. And you can see already what a mess all these different spectrum have in a spectral distribution. And when we look at it over here, because we just looked at that, okay, now here I'm just comparing an Amira. When we look at the camera's response, again, we see that range of color response in terms of Kelvin. The Amira seeing the single white is very warm. It's seeing it, the constructed spectrum, a little higher Kelvin. And then when we go up here, if this was an actual shot and you're in timing, you could most probably get away with these values up here of a 1/8 of a correction necessary on this one. But this at 0.36, that's an 1/8 and 1/4 correction. That is going to be very green light. Where this shows up is you've got the scene, multiple lighting fixtures, and at one point, a subject walks through the frame, possibly light colored hair or light costume, light wardrobe, and they get hit by that key source, 3/4 back, and suddenly it goes green. And there's no motivation in the scene for that person to go green. Now you're sitting with your colorist going, the hell happened back there? Can you float a window in there and sort of take it down without affecting the rest of the scene? Challenging. So this is the kind of thing that you need to test in advance if you're going to work with a light source. Make sure that it may work well in the tungsten zone, but is it going to hold up in the daylight or vice versa? So you need to basically test for both Kelvin ranges that you're shooting in. Once you know this, you could actually use that multi-band fixture, but put in your offset correction to bring it down so that you've neutralized that hue.
Got another great question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you can't really do that when you're shooting. It's very, you don't have the time. Go ahead.
Got a great question here from Jason. Jason, why don't you ask your question again? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, hi, yeah. I'm just wondering how to practically apply this to a job. So when you talk about correction, I mean, if the cameras are showing such discrepancies, would the only way to actually correct them is to use a filter over the lens, or are you just suggesting to tweak the light, or
Tweak the light?
just tweak the lighting?
Tweak the lighting. So what I'm suggesting, and when I wrap up this thing, I'll be referring to painters. What you're dealing with here is you're essentially painting. Using the painter analogy, you're painting with light. Here you have a pigment, which is green. You don't want it to be green. You want it to be more neutral. And I think the more testing you do over time, you will gravitate towards certain fixtures, and you will understand how certain fixtures render the image the way you see it in your mind's eye. Or you will take that fixture and you say, in order for this to work for me, I'm going to have to put on this corrective, offset. But you're very much like a painter, using all these different lights are like different pigments, and it can, I think, only over time and a lot of testing, and this will hopefully, and I know this is not the case, producers should be giving cinematographers a hell of a lot more time in testing. Because the complexity of these sets, when you're talking about ribbon, you're talking about all kinds of lighting fixtures that all have task purpose, but spectrally are different. And this is where you end up spending a lot of time in post trying to sort through that. And some people may not see it, but you're the cinematographer, you know exactly the way it's supposed to look, and you're not getting what you want. But if you had been able to do the testing and were able to isolate where some of these problems exist, then you'd been able to correct it. And something like this, very simply on a gray chart, skin tone and a gray chart will tell you automatically that if you'd set your camera to 6500, dialed in this Kelvin, and rolled camera, you would have seen immediately, whoa, do we have a problem? Okay, if this thing is going to be on the set, let's dial this puppy back, because I'm sure by now they have enough sophistication to be able to add green or magenta. Dial it down, but then be also aware of what does it do to your Kelvin? How is that? Is it warming it up? Is it cooling it up? Is it, again, so there are multiple dynamics at work.
Justin's got another great question. George, do you feel satisfied with your answer?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've got a job coming up where I know my key light's going to be a Celeb 850, and I'm shooting 5600 Kelvin as my color balance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I want that to read neutral on my subject's skin, I have to just stick a gray card in and make sure everything's coming out the way I want it to.
Yep. And that applies to any fixture you do.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because oftentimes what you'll do is there's such a mixture of fixtures out there, as you've mentioned, that we'll often put a white card in where the subject is supposed to be and grab a white balance off of that, depending on what's keying the subject.
Sure.
Or what you want to balance to, and that's basically how you work it. It's not about dialing in different settings on the light. It's getting a quick white balance and shooting.
Sure. Well, I can say that you're already starting right by going with the Celeb 850, because that's a full spectrum white light.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's my favorite.
Okay, but if you were to use something that you hadn't tried before, and it's now because of whatever limitations you have, that's what you have to work with. You want to do that test just to be comfortable knowing how it's going to render out. And especially in a mixed light environment. And it's all of this becomes a problem in a mixed light environment. If you have, I would only hope, and I've never read everyone's fixtures, all I can speak for is ourselves. We go to huge pains to make sure that all of our lights follow the same color imagery. Makes no difference which instrument you take. We have different sizes for different tasks. They should all match up. When you dial in a number, they should all be close within reason. And I say that within reason because these are not scientific lighting instruments. They would cost 4 times that if we were to actually go to that level of accuracy. So you have to go to a certain level where you say, this is acceptable. Is this going to be create an issue? And the biggest issue you usually have, you can live with warmer light, warmer tones and cooler tones. You really can't live with an offset that goes green or magenta, because that becomes jarring.
Awesome. Thank you.
And you also have Frieder's permission to go to the producers, Jason, and ask for more money, as you just said. for more time to prep and test. Justin.
No, seriously, you do. It seems to have been lost. When I was doing features, we always had a week of prep. You had to have prep. I mean, it was demanded. Art department wanted it, wardrobe, makeup. You had to sort through these issues because when you've got a crew standing there, you're burning 150 grand a day, and you're trying to solve a problem. It's the wrong time to be solving that problem. That should have been sorted out in post, pre-production.
Justin Lovell has an excellent question here. I'm going to let Justin ask this question. Justin? Justin, can you hear us?
Unmute.
Allowed to talk.
Does he have the ability?
Oh, you can hear me?
Yeah,
there you go. Gotcha.
Oh, sorry about that, guys. So I'm just have my son here, so if he sticks out in the background, then that's what it is.
Yeah.
My question was just regarding your testing of all of the other LED options, just RGBW and RGBA and the sapphire and the lime green, all those things.
Yeah.
Were you testing those with other manufacturers' lights, or was that from your own bins? Or
No. All I could do is I took what was out there, just like you would reach out and go, that's a cool looking light. I think I'm gonna use that. And then just read off their settings of what they are saying that it's supposed to be putting out.
Right, because I mean, from my understanding, like the lime green stuff, like Hive Lighting, I know is using that quite a bit on their approach, and they're really proud of the results they're getting from that approach. So I guess when you're doing your testing, you're using a light that's obviously optimized for those things. Because if you guys are optimizing yours for warm white, cool white, you're going to get the best results there. But if you were trying to make a light using sapphire and lime green, that's not your wheelhouse. Your wheelhouse is warm white, cool white, right?
Yeah, no, I believe, Hive is a great company and I think they're doing a great product. The challenge for them and any other manufacturer where you're trying to construct spectrum is trying to reconcile the differences in how the different cameras perceive and record the color. And that's why it's so important when I showed those different response curves, those all have a direct influence on how they perceive multi-band wavelengths of light. And so it really, that fixture where I'm saying now, it needs a heavy correction. Knowing what the camera response is, that could be calibrated to zero out and be a perfectly fine light.
Right.
I mean, these are all valid ways of generating white light. The challenge comes into when you've got different cameras, they're going to see it a little differently. So, I mean, for that reason, we've actually now put in, you can pick 4 different cameras to profile, and they work best in a warm light environment. When it comes to daylight, they all tend to respond much better in their native, native color.
So in what you're saying there, and Jason was kind of hinting on this as well, is would your recommendation be to use a neutral setting on the camera and correct the light source to match, or use a white balance on the camera and allow the camera to do the correction?
I would say whatever your key source is. So, you look at a scene and you have the overall scene, you go, what's basically lighting this entire scene? If it's a whole shitload of Kinos, you go, well, that's a color that you can count on. And so if you need to balance it, you take one of your key sources and you balance that key source. If you have a set that has a range of different instruments, then it gets a little more challenging. And you may need to go around in pre-production. This is what we used to remember in HMIs. you have a ton of HMIs, and we line them all up and come up with filter packs for all of them so that we could bring them closer together. And so essentially this is what's happening here, although here you cannot simply go by Kelvin, because now you need to understand there are two elements of colorimetry. One is the camera, the other is the lighting instrument. And so now you really need to look at the light source through the camera and correct the light source from the camera perspective. So once you dial it into neutral, whatever it takes to dial that fixture in, that is going to be your offset. And that's what you want to remember it and record and say, okay, when we're using that head, it's going to have this offset on it for it to harmonize with the rest of the instruments.
Yeah, that all makes sense.
Yeah.
To continue on Justin's question, I guess as well. Why did you guys elect to do a 2700 warm white as opposed to a 2900 warm white?
Because we're trying to reach further into the warm tones with a broader spectrum. And we felt that we could cover the entire, because we wanted to be able to render skin tones more fully in warm tones. And when we're talking about, a filament bulb is like 2700.
Now, and it was interesting because you touched on it briefly as well. I mean, both the tungsten filament and an HMI filament, depending on where they are in their life cycle, will also have slightly different variations of color temperature. I remember a commercial that I gaffed when I used to be a gaffer. I remember my first experience was they got me to line up all the HMIs for this job because they wanted to see what lifespan or what part of the life cycle the HMI bulbs were in, because they started around 65, 6700 and they die at around 55, 5200 Kelvin, depending on how it lasts there. And then we had to have the gels ready to sort of like augment and correct it so it was in the same sort of color space. Speaking a little bit to, I guess, competitors, some competitors do use warm whites that are 29 or 3200. Does that give them an edge in the color spectrum in another way, or no?
No. That's what I'm saying. There's so many different ways you can cook this, you can bake this cake. We chose 27 because we felt we had a good full spectrum, a good broad spectrum of capture that as we blended it together with our daylight, we were able to really hold out a broad spectrum of spectral data that we could, throw on a subject and have it reflect back. So for us, it's just a matter of, a tungsten, a household filament bulb is 2700. And so I chose that as being, well, we had the ability to render 2700 in a phosphor format on an LED and get a nice broad spectrum out of it. I said, let's do that. It just covers a broader range. Because if we, our first, I think our white mode only went to 27 or 29, and then we opened it up in our color mode or our broader spectrum mode, because we know that we're shooting very warm. There's some very warm scenes being shot out there, and we still want to be able to give you as much benefit of that spectral response down at that lower end.
Thanks. I have two more questions here, one for Michael, one for Christopher, before we move on. Keep the train going.
Yep.
But, Michael, why don't you ask your question, sir? Hello, thanks for joining us. Michael, you there, bud? Or you just have to unmute. Oh, Michael doesn't have a microphone. Okay, I'll ask the question for Michael. Michael has a question on photometrics. Why are LED units outputting lower foot candle levels when dialed to lower Kelvin?
Say that again. Why are they?
Why are LED units outputting lower FC levels when dialed to lower Kelvin?
Well, there is a limitation. So within the Kelvin range, the warm tones, in order to be held accurate, they're just not, the phosphors are just not as bright. So you will see, in terms of the overall brightness, the daylight phosphor on an LED is going to be slightly brighter than a warm tone. It's sort of the physics of the phosphors.
Of light.
And we don't want to overdrive the warm tones to maintain that necessarily, because we're also sacrificing longevity. So in principle, you know, any LED, just like a fluorescent, has a lumen degradation curve. Lumen degradation is a function of the influence of heat over time. And so what we try to do is, where every manufacturer publishes their junction temperatures, their peak junction temperature, we want to hold it substantially below that, so that we never have to worry about the fixture drifting in its color. So in fact, we could eke out a lot more light out of our fixtures if we simply jacked them up and pounded a lot more power through a lot more current through the LED. But since we're trying to give these fixtures a lifespan, we purposefully underdrive them. And so to hold that balance in terms of junction temperature, we're going to be slightly lower in light output.
That was actually, Marty, a question I was going to ask to Frieder, in which he kind of answered, was the whole lifespan thing, and how over time a fixture's color would change. You know, so whatever the setting on the back says the light is doing, that say 5 years from now, if the fixture's been used a lot, is it actually really doing that anymore? Because I've seen that happen with our fixtures on our show, that like the ribbon we've installed in sets 5 seasons later, it's not like the red is actually decreased in output. So the color mixes that we created 5 years ago are the same. So we actually have to like compensate for that, which is interesting.
Yeah, no, and that's a function of the technology itself. It's just what it is. You can minimize that by trying to not drive them as hard. We've only had one instance where a fixture came back to us where the entire platen had gone magenta. And the only telltale sign that there had been something amiss was we saw a piece of foreign plastic that was melted into the frame of the fixture. We can only imagine that, and this was from a rental unit in the UK, somebody must have taken it and put it in an oven and baked the entire fixture, because the entire platen went magenta. We replaced the platen, same electronics, boom, everything was back on normal. So somehow those LEDs had been subjected to abnormally high heat for a prolonged period of time.
Awesome. Christopher Ball, ask your question, sir.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, when you're talking about the gel offset, so you do a test on a light and you find that the gel, you need a 0.36 gel adjustment, say. Does that stay consistent through the color range of the light? Or do you need to test that at each? Okay,
yeah,
so it's a pretty wide range.
Part. Yeah, no, that's because that fixture at 3200 was spot on. It was awesome. And as you then increased the Kelvin, it just wandered off. So, you know, it was great. So you can't simply assume, hey, it'll look great in tungsten, it'll be fine in daylight. You better test it for daylight. And again, these are all manufacturers who are trying their best to try to, and they may even be tracking the Planckian for all we know. But it comes down to the camera response at that Kelvin. And if it then sees it as being off the Planckian, which it did in this case, if in fact they're following it. And in fact, well, here's the example. I mean, we can see the color in that chart. It's on the Planckian. So they did everything right as a manufacturer to put it on the Planckian. Yet the camera, because of its response curve structure, and because of the multi-band nature of the light source, the camera just saw it as green. And so a manufacturer can't, I mean, it's very challenging for a manufacturer to test all these different cameras. But this is a net result. So by rights, everything should be fine. You know, if you had a color meter, it's on the Planckian and your Sekonic will show it to you, spot on. Yet, what we don't know, what we can't account for, is the camera profile. That camera response saw it green. So it literally took it off the Planckian as it was responding. So that's the only way you can do that, is you got to roll a camera test and check it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sepe or Seep, I'm so sorry for mispronouncing your name. Ask your question, sir.
Hi, yeah, I was just curious if the main aberration from not matching to camera to light is always either green or magenta, or if there's other sort of
Yeah.
is it
Absolutely.
always those lines, or is it other sort of issues with not having matched the two?
Yeah, again, it could manifest itself. Well, first of all, if we just look at what we've done here on this one, you can see that the actual camera CCT is different. All three different cameras around on the same camera, every light is showing a different Kelvin. So number one, in Kelvin, it's going to be different, which you may or may not find offensive. It may work within the scene. And again, when you're looking at a scene that has a lot of texture to it, a lot of objects in it, subjectively, you may never notice a difference. But the things that we are culturally tuned to identify with are the faces of the actors. And when we see something go funky on that, it tends to, our mind, our brains register that. So yeah.
And sort of cinematographers who really vouch for doing everything tungsten because of the richness. If you put that next to all these numbers, that comes down to actually seeing always off the Planckian, you reckon, or is that actually just the subtlety in which skin tone is rendered?
Put it this way: if you're shooting tungsten always follows the Planckian. Yeah. And because it's a full spectrum light source, the colors are going to be fabulous no matter what you do. And this is what's so frustrating about, our new technology. We are being forced into working with a light source that is not necessarily designed for cinema, but it has so many other advantages. We go, we're going to try and make it work, and we're going to try and make it work as best we can. But since there are so many different manufacturers and everyone's trying their own little way, this is a highly complex color science challenge. And not everyone is up to that challenge. And so,
and do you mind speaking a little bit more about full spectrum white? Is something that I'm still curious about. Like, what exactly entails that concept?
Okay, a full spectrum we have two sources of full spectrum light. One is daylight, one is tungsten. Everything after that is artificial light. So when we developed the first Kino flows, we're using broadband phosphors that replicated daylight and tungsten as best we could with that technology. And it worked very well. Our daylight lamp covers all the way. I mean, we actually cut it off. We put a filter on it. Our safety coating was actually also a UV filter. So from 400 nanometers on up to 700, we had that full spectrum. And to this day, museums are still using the fluorescent daylight from Kino Flow as an archival for their their restoration work, for being able to visibly and also on camera register all the colors. When it comes to LED technology, we're just falling short of that. So it's just that when we look at that spectral scale, are we covering everything from, well, here, we can see it right here on this chart right here. Mm-hmm. At 400, it's dead. There's nothing going on. On the Kino flows, we had spectral data being gathered right across the full range in a very smooth curve. There were peaks in it, and those were mercury lines. And we were able to compensate that, neutralize them by taking the color point and putting it on the Planckian curve. And the response of the film stock was wide enough that it captured that. Didn't capture everything. Like I said earlier, film still had problems with cyan, teal, and some of the oranges. There were some challenges there. But full spectrum light means as much light that covers the broad spectrum from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Everything that your eye sees, the camera should be able to see. Everything that the cameras could, we should have a light source that actually covers that range. And LED technology at this point is not covering the entire range. It's just what it is. And we got to live with it and do the best we can with it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I'll move on. So matching white light. How do we harmonize fixtures when they're using different color mixing approaches? Well, like I just showed, you really can't, but you can get close. XY coordinates, that's a way of matching Kelvin points. But depending on the camera, that discrepancy may still be more or less discernible. Excuse me. Color space such as 709, P3, 2020. All of these define their chromaticity of the red, green, and blue, as well as white, through an equation of up to 100, representing percentage, or if you're working on a desk in terms of increments of 255. So on a desk where you're communicating DMX, you've got 255 increments that you can work with. So now you have apps such as Show Tool Swatch. Some of you may be familiar with it. Now they issue data points, and by clicking on this little arrow over here, you can switch that from being either a percentage value or a value related to the DMX 255 increments. So in this illustration, it's in DMX terms. And so what you're able to do is dial in the color according to these numbers. But it's also important to understand that this app, it has to base it on, these numbers have to be relevant to a gamut. So we determined, after talking to the guy who came up with this, that those data points are all within Rec 709. Now, there are color points that are being defined by a gel on tungsten that fall outside of that gamut. Now, inputting these numbers here will still only give you a value that falls at the crossover point between your green and your red, because it's within that gamut, first of all, of 709. Now you may have, and this is where, if you're going to be using these numbers, you want to be able to set your fixture to 709. If you have your own gamut and it's bigger than this, then using these numbers will put that color point somewhere else. So it's really important to understand that when we're dealing with apps like this, especially Show Tool Swatch, it's already in a gamut, a given gamut. And if you simply take a lighting fixture and dial in this number, and then go to another manufacturer, dial in the same number, they will never match unless you know for a fact that the two gamuts of those different manufacturers match, dead nuts match. The Lee app, gel app, it gives you XY coordinates, and they can give you two ways of looking at it. One is source C for daylight or tungsten, and depending on which one you click, you're going to end up with a different set of numbers, because this white point here for daylight will shift over here for tungsten. So you're going to have a different, different equation to get to that color point. So on the Kino flows, you can do that. We have XY coordinates on there, and you can set your color accordingly. These are the two that I referenced here. So if anybody doesn't have these and wants to get a hold of those, I think they're less than $10 or something on the iPhone, on the App Store. There's one thing that shows up on our menu, which was just now dropped, but if you still haven't switched over to the 5.0 version, we did have a gamut in there that was originally suggested by ESTA, or the Entertainment Services and Technology Association. And they just suggested having a very large gamut. And so they chose the Kodak Pro Photo color space, which in and of itself is actually a D65 white point reference, but they changed it to 32. And that created problems. So they haven't since gone back on that, and now they're just suggesting that all manufacturers, try to color map within XY. And I think XY is how we do all of our color mapping in general, and then we change it. We use that as the base and then offer it in different formats. So I think XY is still a very, very positive way to go. Our color menu, our color space menu kind of looked like that. You could choose 709, P3, Rec 2020. And the idea here is that if another manufacturer offers that feature and you say, okay, I'm going to put everything into Rec 709. If the other instrument is set into 709, then a board operator, desk operator, can now put the same number, apply it to both of those manufacturers. And theoretically, because I haven't actually tested all the different manufacturers, but you'll be a lot closer to color matching than if you're to try to do it some other way. So XY color settings. This is a great way to measure reflected light on a fixture. And I'm thinking, you know, for example, if you are in an environment where you've got light coming through a window, bouncing off a floor, and it's got this wonderful warm tone, you go, wouldn't it be great to just sort of supplement this now with something? Well, what is that color point? Well, you can actually use Kelvin. You could try to match it with Kelvin and capture whatever bounces off that, say it's a wooden floor. Or you could use XY, and now XY will take into it other subtleties that may not be, that may take it off the Planckian, but in a positive way. So XY is an interesting way of capturing other color on a set and trying to replicate it. Same thing if you walk into a bar and there's a wall sconce and you've got a certain color coming off that, you go, I like that ambiance. How do I generate that? Well, with an XY measurement, you'll be able to capture that and replicate it on an instrument, and it should match up. So for that reason now, we're offering XY color matching mode, also offering RGB color gamut selection to help harmonize between different manufacturers. And to just illustrate what that looks like. So in this case, what we're looking at is the ability to set a color space. So let me just, so right here, we're in an RGB mode. And what we want to do is go to a color space. So going back to our general setting, going down to color space, we can now select. Now, the Kino Flow default is that entire gamut that I showed earlier that we have, which is large. So when I go now to 709, that is going to be a slightly smaller space. And you can actually see the color shift when we go from the default to the 709. It desaturates that color. Go to P3, changes again. The ESTA was radically different because it now had a warm white point instead of the daylight white point. So that's sort of how these different settings actually manifest themselves visibly on these settings. And this one, there's an illustration of how we actually use that app to try to set a color. So first, we'll want to take it into a color space, which is identical to the app, so 709. And when we are in the RGB mode, we actually show you that it's in Rec 709 with that little tag on top. And then it's a matter of getting the readings off the app and inputting them. And so now that color will be that desaturated color that falls within the 709 space. And if I now go back to the gel menu, you'll actually see that that gel is now dialed in to Rec 709. And the minute I go in and manipulate the gel setting and move it away from that, you see how the color shifted. So I'm taking it back to a preset gel color, which is the broader gamut than what I had under 709, where I had to shrink down the gamut, and as a consequence, the saturation. The other thing we did is now that we profiled so many cameras, we said, well, we're seeing especially challenges in the warm tone, because we've established how when the camera goes into a warm tone, how it might render skin tones differently. So we started with the Alexa, the Venice, the Panavision DXL, and the Panasonic Varicam. These settings work best when you're in a tungsten mode. That's where we see the largest impact of being able to harmonize the spectrum of the fixture to the capability of the camera. And so here's an example of how that would work. So first of all, if we're in a tungsten mode, it's never 3200. We want to most probably match it more to what true tungsten, especially if you have tungsten instruments in the set. And you now go to camera. We call it a look. It's a lookup table, but it's really a profile. The Kino Flow default is really a default that is structured around the Alexa. When we decided what the default should be, we said, well, what's the more dominant camera in the market? And the Alexa was the one that fell into that category. So you're not going to see a huge difference between the Alexa and the default. And you can, if you're looking at the lamp, you can see there's next to no change. But once we get to the Sony Venice, you see a slight difference, same with the Panavision. Let me just move it forward here. And the Panasonic. So these are all subtleties, which, let me just run it. You can actually see it change. And those are the subtleties which on a skin tone do become noticeable. So, you know, we really need to think of you think of the fixture as a white light generator, and secondarily as a color generator. And we need to remember that not all white light or colors are the same. We need to think of Gamut, use color Gamut selection when dealing with additive color mixing and understanding your workflow gamut, especially if we're trying to harmonize with another manufacturer. And this should be something that you want to do in pre-production. And there's such a thing as an unattainable expectation when colors fall outside the workflow gamut. So you have a wonderful saturated color. Everybody sees it on the set and it's gorgeous, yet once you go to your workflow and it's 709, you'll never be able to hit that saturated color because it's outside of 709. And you especially don't want to do that if you have a director that's hell-bent on getting that color. The other big challenge is if you're on commercials and you have certain Pantone colors. That is the biggest fight that anyone has on a commercial shoot, is trying to hit a Pantone color where you can't do it additively. You may have to work a combination of additive and subtractive, and this is where it gets to be pretty hairy, and that requires some time in pre-production to try to hone in on those colors. If you have a good full spectrum white to begin with, the likelihood of being able to reproduce the Pantone as a reflected color off their box, you know, or off their product, let's say, the more likely that you're going to be able to hit it. XY color matching, very useful in replicating bounce light and other natural lighting locations, you know, light from locations. XY for color picking, again, now that's going to be limited by the gamut of the fixture, and color points that fall outside the gamut, they're going to render most probably at the right hue angle, but at a lower saturation level. Gels on a full spectrum white light, in other words, subtractive color, may render saturated colors better than that limited gamut range of a fixture. Here's something to think about. Think of shooting in zones, and I'll give you an example. John Schwartzman was doing a film, and John Schwartzman ASC was doing a film in at Pinewood in London. It was an Emma Thompson film. And this was at the point where we had just brought out the camera profiles, and he was working with a DXL. And he said, well, I want to use the Kinos and dial them into the DXL and just make sure that I have consistency throughout the set with all of my skin tones. So the producers agreed with it. Rental company managed to get the number of units that he needed for all the interior of the set. But they said, listen, we got a lot of other stuff over here. We got a huge inventory of something that's silver and blue, and we'd like you need to work with that as well. And he said, okay, I can do that. So what he set up is a 2-zone system of lighting. One was everything that was inside, within proximity of the actors where you would see the skin tone. That was all lit with the Kinos dialed to the camera. On all the backings in the set, anything coming through a window that had shears, he used the other light source, which worked and harmonized perfectly fine because there was a consistency. And so it's much easier to work with a consistent light source that is associated with the exterior of a set or also coming through a window. And then everything inside was now consistent on skin tones. So the colorist noticed this immediately because a lot of the normal corrective actions that would have to be taken now suddenly fell away. And he was going, what do you want me to do with this? I said, well, if it looks good, just let's roll with it. Just keep going. And in fact, the amount of time they spent in post color correction was absolutely minimal. It came more to dealing with exteriors and that kind of thing. So thinking of shooting in zones is another way of approaching this. And again, you have to think of a painterly way of doing this because your lights are your pigment and you're creating your own challenges when you, without forethought, just simply mix these units and expect it all to come out homogeneous. The other thing that I haven't talked about earlier, but is worth mentioning here is you need to pick appropriately sized fixtures to ensure color stability throughout the entire dimming range. Now, you also have to ask, does a fixture track the Planckian? And I've noticed from other manufacturers, when they dim, they fall off the Planckian. When you simply dim a LED, they shift in color, and you need to account for that. And so we run a rather complex algorithm where we can, number one, blend at the same time as we're dimming. We can take corrective action and keep it on the Planckian. There does come a point, however, when you're dealing with something like, say, L80 or a Celeb 850, and now you want to take it down to, 2%. Depending on the Kelvin setting, depending on the color setting, at a certain point, because you're dealing with 5 elements that are dimming down in unison, at some point, one of those elements is going to fall out because it's the lowest setting that it's at. And at that point, your color can skew. Now, this varies between manufacturers. For that reason, some manufacturers cut out early. We're able to hold 0.2%. We're seeing some between manufacturers, some drop off at 15%, some at 10, some maybe a little lower. And so, again, if you take the right sized instrument and you need to be operating at a low Kelvin, it'd be great, not just for the Kinos, but for any manufacturer, if you can keep it down in the 20% range. On the Kinos, you can go a lot lower. I just can't speak for the other guys. But again, these are things you want to test for in pre-production.
Well, we got a question here.
Yeah.
Dale, hello. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, hello. I'm assuming you can all hear me. I'm unmuted.
Yep. Gotcha.
My apologies if this question was somewhat answered earlier. Like some people, I'm multitasking a little bit as I'm following along, but I don't think it's been covered. Which is, in a perfect scenario, like you said, you get, it'd be great to get a week to do prep. A lot of jobs, particularly like, so let's say a commercial job where you might be having to match to a client's logo color, for example.
Right.
Practically, a lot of that, of course, can be solved in post-production. But what I'm really looking at here is, what do you recommend in terms of a testing protocol in the absence of sophisticated spectrometers that you might have, in terms of what we set our cameras at to get the quickest result that will help us come to a lighting decision on the day? Because, whether I'm shooting with a red, which is a raw camera, then I can be shooting with an FX9 the next day, which I might be shooting in, say, Cinetone. And we can play this game with every sort of camera and profile in terms of log settings, because, the idea between log and raw is that a competent colorist will be able to make any color look like any other color, sort of like they can swing the matrix around. Of course, as you mentioned, you have an element to your scene where you have a light in the background, suddenly it's shifted to a color you didn't plan it, and then you have to start windowing and playing that game, which can get tricky. So the issue here that I haven't felt that I've gotten an answer from is, from someone who may not have as much prep time, what do you recommend to cinematographers and shooters who may be shooting at different cameras in terms of like what settings, what picture profiles to be shooting, what LUTs to be using, that we can start to see some quick results without advanced spectrometer data?
Sure. I think you should work with your camera in a profile or mode that you're most comfortable with. But at that point, if that's what you're locked into on your camera, now take your lighting instruments and do that very simple color test. Gray card and a skin tone together with a Kelvin setting that whatever your tungsten setting is going to be, whatever your daylight setting is going to be, and then just compare the different fixtures and see whether they render the same color. That is the simplest thing you can do. And I think what will happen over time, you'll become comfortable working with certain instruments that you know, or certain cameras that you know. When I'm working on X camera and I have 2 or 3 manufacturers, I know how to either do a slight correction on one of the other instruments, but I know that these tools are going to work together. And this is something where experience over time is going to do that. So whenever you get test time, is to try and log that information as best you can, so you can refer back to it later on. And this is no different from a painter mixing his pigments. They would Vermeer and Rembrandt were very particular about the pigments that they work with because they were consistent, they can count on it. And I think the same will happen with your lighting, your choice of lighting instruments. You know that there will be certain instruments you can rely on. And if you're trying something new, just because it is a task instrument that is perfectly suited for the shot, then go ahead, do the camera test, camera set to whatever your daylight scene is going to be, whatever your tungsten scene is going to be, and then just compare it to the source that you trust and see how far off it is. And what do you need to do to give it that corrective offset? And that to me is, I think, the simplest and quickest way.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Camera profiles, those are best applied when we're working in a warm light, because I think that's where it really has its most effect. The profiles have, when I say little effect on gel colors, I really have to say is I haven't done enough research to know exactly how much of an impact the gel colors are, because some gels are very subtle in terms of saturation, that the different cameras, you're going to see some difference more than likely, but that's a whole nother game. That, again, if there's a key color that you want to work with, you got to test for it and make sure that that's the way you want to go. I keep referring to Rembrandt and Vermeer, so I come back to that. So just as they were very careful in their choice of pigments, I think today's cinematographers must choose their spectral palettes carefully. And the spectral palette is essentially your paintbrush, your light. You can't just simply mix things and expect them to work without understanding their colorimetry. Bottom line, good, broad spectrum white light goes a long way in solving color rendering. So all I can do is stress pre-production testing of the camera. It's more important than ever before. You got to test your choice of lights. You got to compare them. You got to harmonize them with other manufacturers. You got to test them to the camera, to the daylight or tungsten balance. And as you do this, you build up a database for yourself of what you know works and what doesn't work. And anything new that comes on, first thing you do is try to at least get some perspective on how that unit performs. So fixtures color science is the 21st century pigment. Fixtures are the brushes. Just be real careful how you choose your pigment, or suffer the consequences when color grading. And that, my friends, is it. And I thank you very much for all your patience in sitting through this. I'm going to stop share and go back to, so. Yeah.
Well,
So I'm open to questions. There's a lot there to absorb, but I hope I've sort of tried to illustrate where the challenges lie and how we have to start thinking about spectrum versus just it's a light.
Well, thank you very much, Frieder. We have a few exit questions that I want to get to that I sort of waited to the end. So we'll start off with Justin Lovell. Justin, I know that your question pertained to something a little bit further back, but why don't you give us, why don't you take a stab at it right now?
No, hey, yeah, just simple. I know some manufacturers, when they get to like 3200, you're using the warm white, and when you're at 5600, you're using the cool white. But when you're in the middle at like 4000, you could be blending the warm white and the cool white together and give you kind of like a boost mode to get more output out of the light source. Is that typically something that's an option with the Kino fixtures, or is that, or do you just try and make yours consistent throughout and not have an exposure shift?
Yeah, so the whole boost mode thing is something that you have to be careful of, because when you're taking two sources and simply boosting them because you can, yes, you can, but what is it doing to the junction temperature of the LED? The way our principle is that we hold a certain wattage or a certain current level that is balanced across the board. And as we shift in Kelvin, we try to hold that the luminance point. It's very important for us to maintain that luminance point. So if you change a little bit in Kelvin or change a color or something, we don't want you to have to change your exposure level. Yes, you can simply take two LEDs and just jam them hard and boost the light output from it. But that's going to influence the overall longevity of that, the color stability of the LED. And fundamentally, we're just not going to do it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Michael, go ahead. You can ask your question now. You there, Michael? I'll wait for Michael to chime in, or maybe Michael didn't have the microphone. I can't remember now. I'll ask the next gentleman here. Sorry, Sepe, tell me that, pronounce your name for me, brother.
It's Sep.
Sep, thank you.
From Belgium, it's Dutch.
Thank you, Sep, for your patience. Go ahead, ask your question.
No, I was just curious. I remember at the time when Vice, the Adam McKay movie, came out, I heard that Greg Fraser did a lot of testing to match LED, which he really likes, to the film response. If that was anything that you were involved with, or do you know what they found and what they did to work with the LEDs for celluloid?
No, we did not. We were not involved in that. I mean, our research has been ongoing for the last 10 years or so when we started all this. So now it's all internal.
But is there something that you found in your research that is specific to how to use LED on an analog workflow, or is that something you can speak to of what LED?
No. I'll just give you a sort of a heads up on where we're going with our research. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is the whole introduction of VR shooting. And so the notion of shooting, the camera recording an LED screen, which in and of itself is red, green, blue. The camera can render those colors very accurately, since it's only it's doing a direct view of these RGB elements. But if you were now to try to use that same display as a light source, where it's now trying to throw an illuminant onto your subject matter, you're dealing with a deficient spectrum. So we've now developed just have patent pending on it now, a light source where we're using display technology, where we have an instrument that has 400 individually addressable pixels, but we're extrapolating from the video feed taking the RGB values, extrapolating the white values from that combination, but rendering them as a full spectrum white, which means that we're creating a hybrid light source of sorts where we can be fully gen-locked and harmonized with the 3D volume, yet we can isolate out of that display a region of white light that we can literally move within the scene and project that white light onto your subject, rendering the subject colors accurately, which you can't do simply with an RGB panel.
Right.
So that's sort of the new exciting direction that we're going in when it comes to, the next step in colorimetry for production.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question that we had was from Michael Yaroshevsky, which said, are Kino fluorescents going to continue to be manufactured for the foreseeable future?
So we have a lot of lamps. I still have a lot of phosphor. My choice of factories is rapidly diminished. We produced our last ballast, fluorescent ballast, in January of last year. And the reason for that, very simply, is everything's moved to LED. We continue to support it on repairs. We have spare parts for everything, and we'll always be able to support the fluorescent product. And we've had programs where people who want to upgrade into LED have always been able to utilize their fluorescent inventory as a trade-in and help mitigate some of the costs of changing over. And that was very successful. That was very well received. And we also did that on some of our early LED that were bicolor to try to get people to move into the current mode, the current color system. The latest introduction we did just now, just in the last month, we released RDM. So our 5.0 release is now available. And so now you can operate, you can change all the modes, do everything on the fly directly off the desk. So that's a very big positive moving forward.
I had a question about, you guys are able to put in camera color profiles into your ballast system. Is that, that's a great luxury to have. Is that an expensive process to put in technologically?
Sadly, it's the process of measuring all that stuff. It takes us about 2 weeks per camera to process all the data and work through it. It's one guy doing it. So yeah, it's laborious, which is why we've kept it to sort of the primary cameras that we see that are out there. I'd like to expand it more into the Reds. I'd like to get the Canons in there. And there's a potential later on this year we might be able to do that, to offer more of that.
Is it something as being, a lighting manufacturer, can you not sort of hold camera companies accountable to sort of giving you the data? No.
Yeah, we tried. Right. We were very blessed to have Kodak and Fuji, who recognized immediately that with a new technology that was becoming ubiquitous in the industry, it made absolute sense to work with them. Now, maybe it was for them, since there was only one manufacturer making these lamps, they felt it was to their advantage. So whenever Fuji or Kodak came up with a new film stock, they would send me Excel spreadsheets with all the data. I knew exactly what was going on. And we could very easily migrate our color science in a way that would better harmonize to the film stock. When you're talking about, 50 to 100 camera manufacturers, and, and if you just look at the primary camera manufacturers, their evolution of their own color systems is so rapid. I think they just are afraid to get involved with a lighting manufacturer. And they may not trust us to do justice to it. I don't know. Mind you, Panavision was very supportive and gave us a lot of assistance when we were measuring all these cameras. So some people get it, some people don't. Yeah, it would make absolute sense for them to cooperate with us. But a lot of other companies like us wouldn't know what to do with the data if they had it.
It's interesting that you use a word like trust when describing sort of like cameras or camera companies, because I kind of feel that, you know, every manufacturer has a goal at heart, which is still sort of have that optimal white light.
Yeah.
So I don't understand, I guess, keeping that kind of, that secret sauce secret, and why not work with somebody to kind of bring in a more harmonious white light? That seems very strange to me.
Yeah, well, I think, again, one of the reasons that I don't specifically identify cameras on the gamut and on the spectral curves is because this is information that I'm sure camera manufacturers aren't crazy about having out there as a comparison, because people may interpret them incorrectly and say, well, look at this compared to that camera. This camera's not as good as that camera. That's not at all the case. These cameras are pretty much spectacular across the board. They have subtleties, though, that make them unique. And cinematographers who are very focused on a look will be able to determine that for themselves. And what I'm illustrating is, yes, there are these subtleties that you're seeing. Here's the explanation why it's different. And you have to understand that when you now have colorimetry of a fixture and colorimetry of a camera, and they're all different and they keep changing, that's where the chaos ensues. Mm-hmm. So as a camera manufacturer, they're afraid of, you know, how will this information be disseminated and how's it going to make them look? They're struggling enough as it is to try to make themselves look like they're the best. When it shouldn't be a matter of best, it's a matter of what's appropriate for the style of shooting that you're doing and what are you trying to achieve with this piece of recording technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting concept, as well as like the race to be ubiquitously the best, as opposed to embracing sort of a camera's own culture and ecosystem and color science to be unique unto themselves, i.e. Kodak and Fuji. You know, why people aren't embracing their unique color sciences, because there's nothing wrong with having a slightly different color science. It's the way that your company approaches it. You know what I mean? So it's just interesting. Is there any other questions that anybody has? Does anybody want to raise their hand? Because I think if there are no other questions, then I just want to thank Frieder for spending the better part of his day explaining to us what we've been doing wrong for the past 15 years.
Not a matter of wrong. It's a matter of explaining why we're frustrated. You know, when you think about it historically, if you look at the evolution of cameras, I mean, behind me, we'll see, there it is. That's an old ornament from around 1910. And every camera advancement was because cinematographers needed to do something more, something beyond what the existing piece was doing. And you look at the entire development of camera technology, these were all mechanical devices that made our work easier. And now we're at a point where we're dealing with cameras where it's no longer just the ergonomics of the camera or the optics. It's now about how is this actually, you know, playing into the whole workflow and whatnot. There's no more film processing. There's no more handling of film. There's no more loading of mags. And so now this is this whole new thing. Who drives that? So for the most part, we as cinematographers are still trying to dictate to these manufacturers what they need to do to make our life easier. And so you're right. Why wouldn't they also listen to the lighting manufacturers or try to corral in the lighting manufacturers to make their stuff look better? So anyway.
Well, Frieder, on behalf of the CSC, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Martin Wojtunek. I'm the CSC Education Co-Chair. I'm also on the online content committee of the CSC. If anybody has any questions, please reach out to the CSC or myself in particular. Frieder, thank you so much again on behalf of the CSC and everybody here for spending your Sunday with us. In our case, it's been afternoon, and in your case, it's in the morning. Thank you so much, and everybody, I hope to see you around the block.
Yeah, and thank you again for this great opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I wish everyone stay well. We're going to get through this COVID thing, and see you on the next big show.
Thank you very much, Frieder.